There is a blue mechanical pencil in the bottom drawer of my desk, and I have moved offices 4 times in 20 years, and every time it is the first thing I pack and the last thing I unpack, wrapped in the same square of felt, because I have never once let it touch anything else in the box. It doesn't write anymore. The lead dried up sometime during the Clinton administration. Probably. I keep it anyway. He left it on the counter of the drafting room on a Thursday night in October, the way he did almost every Thursday for 6 years, and I used to tell myself I kept it in case he came back for it. He never came back for it. I think some part of me always understood that the pencil wasn't really the thing I was keeping. In 15 years, Robert Callahan and I shook hands maybe a dozen times, and touched. Beyond that, not at all. I want to say that first, before anything else, because everything I'm about to tell you will sound, at moments, like it's building towards something it never actually became. It didn't. Whatever this is, whatever this was, it lived entirely in the space between 2 people who never crossed the 18 inches of air that usually separated us at a drafting table. I need you to hold on to that fact the way I've had to hold on to it for most of my adult life, because it's the only thing that makes the rest of it true, instead of just sad. My name is Naomi Reyes. I'm 44. I live in Sacramento now, in a rented house with a bad water heater and a very good oak tree, and I run the residential design studio at a firm you've probably never heard of. I should tell you how I got here, because the order matters. I've turned this story over so many times in my head that I know exactly which parts I used to skip. And skipping them is how I lied to myself for 2 decades. So I'm going to tell it in order, the way it actually happened, even the parts that don't flatter me. I grew up in Fresno, the older of 2 kids. My father ran a hardware store that had been his father's, and I was the first person in my family to go to college for something as impractical sounding as architecture. I graduated in 2003 with a decent portfolio and no connections. And I took the first job I was offered, which was a drafting position at a 9-person firm called Callahan & Wren on the 2nd floor of a converted feed store downtown. I was 23. Robert Callahan was 51, the founding partner, married 26 years to a woman named Eleanor, whom I'd meet exactly 4 times in the years that followed. Always briefly, always kindly. I want to describe him the way I actually saw him then, not the way I understand him now. Because the difference between those 2 versions of Robert is most of what this story is about. At 23, he seemed to me less like a man than like a kind of weather system, steady, low pressure, present in a room before you noticed he'd entered it. He wore the same 3 cardigans in rotation. He hummed while he worked, tunelessly, always the same 4 notes, and none of us ever figured out what song they were from, if they were from anything at all. He had a habit of tapping a drawing twice with 2 fingers when he approved of it, and withholding that tap when he didn't, so that within a month every drafter in that office had learned to watch his hand instead of his face. The firm did mostly residential work, additions and remodels, and the occasional custom build for people who'd saved a long time for it, and Robert ran what he called crit nights, Thursdays, after the rest of the staff had gone home, when he'd sit with whoever had a project moving through the pipeline and go over the drawings line by line. I got put on the Thursday rotation in my 2nd month. More out of necessity than favor, I was slow. And he was patient, and patience was in short supply everywhere else in that office. What started as correction became, over months, something closer to conversation. He'd ask why I'd made a decision before he told me whether it was right. He kept a French press on the windowsill and made 2 cups without asking, every single Thursday, for 6 years, and it took me embarrassingly long to notice that he'd started making mine the way I actually drank it. Too much cream, no sugar, without my ever having told him. There was a gap between us that I want to name plainly, because the whole shape of this story depends on it, and because I spent a long time pretending I didn't see it. He was my employer. He was 28 years older than I was. He was married, and not unhappily, as far as any of us could tell. Eleanor called the office sometimes, just to check in on him, and he'd get a particular softness in his voice that had nothing to do with any of us. None of that was hidden. None of it was a secret I discovered later and felt betrayed by. It was simply the fixed geometry of the thing from the very first Thursday, and both of us, I think, understood exactly where the walls were. But there were motifs, even then. Small ones I wouldn't understand the weight of until much later. The blue pencil, which he used only for markups and only, it seemed, on the drawings he cared most about getting right. A line he said to me at least once a month, in one form or another, build it twice, once on paper and once in your head, and see which house you'd rather live in. Which I thought for years was just a design philosophy, and which I now think was maybe the only way he knew how to tell me something true without saying it directly. And the chair by the drafting room window, third from the door, that was mine every Thursday for 6 years, that no one else ever sat in even when I wasn't there. Though nobody ever said out loud that it was reserved, I didn't think of any of this as strange. I think that's the part people find hardest to believe when I tell this story now, that for years it simply felt like the ordinary furniture of my working life. It was only much later, once I'd left, once the Thursdays had stopped, that I went back through those years and understood how carefully, how deliberately, he had built a whole architecture of small kindnesses that never once asked anything of me in return. The first time I understood that something was happening that didn't have a name, it was late spring 2006, and it was such a small thing that I almost didn't tell you about it at all. We were 3 years into the Thursdays by then. I'd broken up with a boyfriend, a nice, forgettable man named Curtis, who sold medical equipment and wanted, reasonably, for me to want the things he wanted. And I came in the following Thursday tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Robert didn't ask what was wrong. He never asked what was wrong. That was one of the rules of the thing, though neither of us had ever spoken the rule aloud. He just made the coffee, set mine down in front of me, and instead of pulling up the drawing we'd been working on, he pulled up a set of plans from years earlier, a little bungalow renovation from before I'd started at the firm, and said, "This one still bothers me. Tell me what's wrong with the roof line." And we spent 2 hours on a house that had already been built, that didn't need fixing anymore, because he'd understood, without my saying anything, that I needed an hour of thinking about something that couldn't hurt me. I went home that night and sat in my car outside my apartment for a long time before I went in, because I couldn't explain to myself why I felt so unreasonably, disproportionately grateful. I want to be honest about what I don't know, because I've earned the right to be uncertain in the telling of my own story. I don't know if Robert felt, in that moment, or in the 100 moments like it that followed over the years, anything close to what I was starting to feel. I've turned it over from every angle a person can turn a thing over. There were Thursdays where I'd swear I saw something cross his face when I laughed at one of his terrible jokes, a kind of arrested look, gone before I could be sure I hadn't invented it. There were Thursdays where he was simply my boss, tired, 40 minutes from home, thinking about his own life, and I was a 26-year-old drafter projecting a novel onto an ordinary friendship because it was easier than admitting I didn't have much of a life outside that office. Both of those things were probably true at once, in different measures, on different nights. That's the part I've made peace with slowest, that I will likely never know the exact proportions. What I can tell you is what happened, because the things that happened don't require me to know what was in his head. There was a project that fall, a hillside house for a couple who kept changing their minds, That ran long, and Robert and I ended up staying past midnight twice in the same week, working through structural revisions by the light of one drafting lamp, because he refused to turn on the overheads that late, said they made the drawings look flat. On the second of those nights, close to 1 a.m, I fell asleep sitting up in the chair, the third one from the door, for maybe 10 minutes, and when I woke there was a jacket over my shoulders that hadn't been there before, and Robert was still at the table across from me, still working, not looking at me at all. As if he hadn't just quietly given me the only warm thing in the room and then gone back to his drawings so I wouldn't have to thank him for it. Denise Ortolan noticed before I did, or noticed and said something before I let myself notice. Denise ran the front office, had been at the firm almost as long as Robert, and had, I think, watched a great many things pass through that building over the years without ever once being fooled by any of them. She caught me refilling my coffee one morning and said, without any real preamble, "You know he talks about your work to Eleanor. She asked me last week if you were doing all right, said Robert seemed worried about you." I remember the exact temperature that ran through me, somewhere between pleasure and dread. I said something about how that was kind of him, and Denise looked at me for a second too long and said, "That's not what I asked you." And I said I didn't know what she meant, and we both let it drop, because we both understood there was nothing further to say that wouldn't require one of us to say something true. I never told anyone what I actually thought was happening between us, not fully, not even Denise, not even the one time my sister asked me outright, during a phone call, why I talked about my boss so much. I told her he was a good mentor. That was true. It just wasn't the whole truth, and I knew it wasn't, even as I said it. The motifs kept accumulating in ways I only assembled afterward. The blue pencil, always for the drawings he cared about. The 4-note hum, which I finally placed in 2007. It was the opening bar of a song from a record Eleanor had loved when they were young. He mentioned it once, offhand, and I filed the fact away like something precious, though I couldn't have told you why, and billed it twice. Once on paper, and once in your head, a line I heard him say to other drafters too, over the years, in exactly the same tone, and which stopped feeling special to me for a while, until I understood much later that the meaning of a phrase can change entirely depending on who's being told to imagine the other version of the house. There was a summer, 2007, when the firm sent a small delegation to a residential design conference in Portland. Robert, myself, and Marcus Ibbotson, a senior drafter who'd been there almost as long as Robert had. 3 nights in a hotel with a lobby bar that stayed open late, and on the second night Marcus went up early with a headache, and Robert and I stayed down in the bar until almost midnight, talking about nothing in particular. A competitor's portfolio, a project that had fallen through, his daughter's wedding, which was still a year off but which he was already dreading having to pay for. At some point the conversation went quiet in the comfortable way it sometimes did, and I remember watching him turn his glass in slow circles on the bar top and thinking, with a kind of clarity that frightened me a little, that if I said the wrong right thing in that exact moment, something might actually happen. I didn't say it. I've never been entirely sure, looking back, whether I didn't say it because I was afraid of what would happen if I did, or because some steadier part of me already understood that whatever happened wouldn't be worth what it cost either of us afterward. He paid the tab before I could reach for my wallet, said goodnight, and took the stairs instead of the elevator, which I noticed because our rooms were both on the same floor, and the elevator would have been faster. I took the elevator alone and stood in it a long time after it had already stopped on my floor. Marcus noticed something over those 3 days, though I don't think he ever said it outright to me. He mentioned once, on the flight home, apropos of nothing, that Robert didn't usually stay downstairs that late with anyone, that he was a 9 o'clock bedtime man as far as Marcus had ever known him. going back a decade. I said maybe conference schedules threw people off. Marcus said maybe, in a tone that made it clear he didn't think that was the whole of it, and then he went back to his crossword, and neither of us ever brought it up again. Back at the office that fall, the small motifs kept accumulating the way sediment does. You don't notice a single layer. Only, eventually, the depth of the whole thing. He'd started, without either of us remarking on it, setting aside articles he thought I'd find interesting. Not just architecture pieces, but odd things. A profile of a woman who restored old typewriters, a piece about lighthouse keepers, clipped from actual newspapers, left on my desk with no note, so that I'd only know they were from him because no one else in that office read a physical newspaper anymore. I kept every one of them for a while, in a folder I told myself was for inspiration, until the folder got thick enough that I had to admit to myself what it actually was. There was a Christmas party that same year where Eleanor was present, and at one point, crossing the room to refill a drink, I passed close enough to hear Robert telling a colleague's wife a story about a house he and Eleanor had almost bought early in their marriage, a story I'd never heard before, told with real warmth, and I remember feeling something complicated and a little ugly in myself. Not jealousy exactly, more a kind of vertigo at being reminded, in the middle of an ordinary party, of the whole enormous life he had that had nothing to do with Thursdays at all. I left that party early. He caught my eye on the way out, and there was something in his face I couldn't read, and I drove home telling myself it had been a good idea to leave before I'd had too much wine and said something I couldn't take back. By 2008, I had started, privately, to build a second version of my own life in my head. The one where the 28 years and the wedding ring and the whole fixed architecture of the thing simply weren't there, and I want to tell you clearly that I am not proud of the hours I spent in that other house. I never once said anything to him that could have been mistaken for an invitation. I want that understood. But I thought about it. I built it, floor by floor, on nights when I should have been thinking about almost anything else, and then I'd come in on Thursday and sit in the third chair and drink coffee made exactly the way I liked it, and I'd fold the whole imagined house back up and put it away. Because I already knew, even then, exactly what stood in the way of it ever being real. I said I'd tell you the obstacle without dressing it up as a villain, because it wasn't one, and I think that's actually the harder version of this story to tell. It would almost be easier if there had been someone to be angry at. There wasn't. There was only a marriage that had already survived 26 years by the time I arrived, and a man who had built his whole adult life around not being the kind of person who broke things. Eleanor Callahan was, by every account I ever gathered, a decent, unremarkable, quietly happy woman. She'd been a school teacher, retired by the time I knew of her, and she and Robert had 2 grown children who came home for Christmas and a house out past the county line with a garden she was proud of. I met her 4 times over those years, once at a firm holiday party, twice in passing when she stopped by the office, once at a colleague's retirement dinner, and every time she was warm to me in a specific, easy way that I came, eventually, to find almost unbearable. Because it was so obviously the warmth of a woman who had absolutely no reason to see me as anything other than one of her husband's employees. I don't think she was wrong to see it that way. I think that was, in fact, the entire point of how carefully Robert had built the thing between us, so that there would never be anything for her to be wrong about. He talked about her more than you'd expect. If you were imagining this as some tragic, loveless marriage he was quietly escaping on Thursday nights, he wasn't escaping anything. He'd mentioned some small argument they'd had about the garden, or a trip they were planning, or her sister's health, in the same easy tone he used for everything else, and I understood, even at my most privately hopeful, that I was never being told these things to make me feel like his confidante instead of his wife. I was being told them, I think now, because he wanted me to always have the facts in front of me. He never let me forget the shape of his life, even while he was building this strange, careful second structure alongside it. There was one night, late in 2009, where the distance between those two facts, the marriage that was real, and whatever this was, collapsed down to almost nothing, and I want to tell you about it exactly as it happened, without making it bigger than it was. Because making it bigger than it was is exactly the kind of thing I promised myself I wouldn't do in the telling of this. We'd finished a difficult set of drawings close to 11 at night, a rare thing even for us, and he walked me down to the parking lot after, which he didn't usually do. It had started raining, hard, the kind of sudden valley rain that comes out of nowhere in October, and we ended up standing under the awning by the feed store's old loading door, waiting it out. Closer together than the drafting table ever put us, close enough that I could see he hadn't shaved that morning, which for some reason struck me as the most intimate detail I'd ever noticed about him. Neither of us said anything for a while. Then, he said, not looking at me, watching the rain instead, Eleanor used to stand under awnings just like this with me, before we were married, when I didn't have a car that worked. And I understood, immediately and completely, exactly what he was doing. He was not telling me a story about the rain. He was drawing, very gently, in the only language he had, the exact boundary of what this could ever be. At the one moment where the boundary might otherwise have blurred, I said, "That's a good story," and he said, "It's the only one I've got that fits this weather," and we stood there another 5 minutes without saying anything else. And when the rain let up, he said goodnight, the way he always did. And I drove home with my hands too tight on the wheel, and I never once, in 15 years, came closer to it than that. I've asked myself since whether he did that on purpose, whether the mention of Eleanor under the awning was a door being closed, or a door being acknowledged as already closed, which isn't quite the same thing. I think, now, it was closer to the second. I don't think Robert Callahan ever, not once, seriously entertained the shape of a life without her. I think what he entertained, what I think we both entertained, in our very different, very careful ways, was a second, smaller room built onto the side of both our real lives, a room with exactly one chair in it, where something that never got a name could exist without ever threatening the structure it was attached to. I went home that night and I did not build the other house in my head. I think that was the first time in 3 years I didn't. Something about the awning had made the whole exercise feel suddenly childish, or maybe just unbearably sad, and instead I sat at my kitchen table and drew, badly, a floor plan for a life that was actually mine. Small, single, unremarkable. And I kept that drawing for a long time afterward, in the same drawer as the pencil, as a kind of private admission that I understood, finally, what Thursday nights were, and weren't, ever, going to become. The Thursdays ended the way most long, quiet things end, not with a single dramatic break, but with a slow attrition of ordinary circumstance that only looks, in hindsight, like it was building toward an ending at all. In 2011, Callahan and Wren picked up a run of larger commercial work, the kind of projects that changed the rhythm of the whole office, and I was moved off residential and onto a team that answered to Warren, the Wren half of the firm's name, a competent, humorless man who had never once, in 8 years, made anyone a second cup of coffee. The Thursday crit nights didn't stop right away. They thinned. Once a week became once every 2, then once a month, then an occasional thing that happened when a project of mine crossed Robert's desk, and he asked, almost formally, if I wanted to go over it after hours the way we used to. I always said yes. I want to be honest that I always said yes. In 2013, I got an offer from a mid-sized firm in Sacramento. Better money, a real path to running my own studio eventually. The kind of offer a smart 29-year-old wasn't supposed to turn down for sentimental reasons. I told Robert on a Tuesday, in his office, not a Thursday, because I think some part of me didn't want to say it in the room where the other version of this conversation might have happened. He didn't try to talk me out of it. He asked good, specific questions about the new firm's portfolio, the way he'd have asked about any drafter's career move, and then he did the thing with 2 fingers, tapping the desk between us twice, the old sign of approval, and said, "You should take it. This is a good drawing, Naomi. You should build the real thing." I've thought about that sentence more than almost anything else he ever said to me, because it was, on its surface, entirely about my career, and underneath that surface, I've never been able to decide if it was also something else, an instruction, maybe, or a kind of permission, or just an ordinary man being genuinely glad for someone he'd mentored for a decade. I didn't ask him to clarify. That wasn't a thing we did. I left that April. There was a small firm party, sheet cake in the break room, a card everyone signed. Robert's contribution to the card was 4 words, "Build it twice, always," which nobody else in that office would have understood the weight of, and which I read alone in my car, in the parking lot, before I could make myself drive away. For a long time after that, I told myself a very specific story about what Robert had been to me, and I want to describe that story honestly, because it's the version I carried for almost a decade before it got complicated by what I eventually learned. I told myself it had been a mentorship with an undercurrent, nothing more, that whatever I'd felt on my side had probably been mostly one-directional. The ordinary crush of a young woman for an older man who'd been kind to her at a formative time, and that Robert, decent as he was, had likely felt something adjacent to fondness and nothing further, and had simply been careful, as a good man is careful, not to let a young employee's evident feelings become anyone's problem. It was a manageable story. It let me be a little embarrassed about my 20s without having to reckon with anything larger. I got married, briefly, in my early 30s, to a structural engineer named Paul. A marriage that ended amicably 4 years later over the ordinary erosions of 2 people who'd wanted different lives. And through all of it, Robert Callahan existed in my memory as a closed, sweet, faintly sad chapter that I had, I believed, correctly filed under things that were never really about him at all. We exchanged Christmas cards for a while. Then, for a few years, nothing, not a falling out, just the ordinary silence of 2 people whose lives had genuinely diverged. I heard, secondhand, through Denise, who I stayed in touch with, that Robert had retired in 2019, that the firm had been sold to a regional group, that Eleanor's health had started to decline not long after. I sent a card. I didn't hear back, which didn't surprise me. I imagined him occupied with things far larger than an old employee's correspondence. In March of this year, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize, and a man introduced himself as an attorney named Feldman, and told me that Robert Callahan had died the previous week of a heart attack at home, and that I was named in his will, and would I be able to come in for a reading. I want to tell you honestly what I felt in that first moment, because it wasn't grief. Not yet. Grief came later, in waves I wasn't prepared for. What I felt first was a kind of vertigo, a sense that a door I had spent 15 years believing was closed and correctly filed had just, without warning, been shown to still be slightly open, and I had no idea, standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, what was on the other side of it. Feldman's office was on the 3rd floor of a building downtown that smelled like new carpet, and I sat in a low leather chair across from a wide desk and a stack of folders, and for a moment, before he said anything, I had the absurd, out-of-place thought that I should have worn something more formal as though I were about to be evaluated rather than informed. Ms. Reyes, thank you for coming in. He had the folder open already, a single document clipped inside it, and beside it a second, smaller item I couldn't quite make out from where I sat. Something wrapped in cloth. I'll be straightforward with you, because Mr. Callahan was very specific about how he wanted this handled. Most of his estate is exactly what you'd expect. The house, to Eleanor, in full, some smaller bequests to his children and a few colleagues. But there's a separate provision, set up as its own trust, funded incrementally over about 18 years, and you're the sole beneficiary of it. I remember saying, I'm sorry, 18 years? The account was opened in 2005, he said, checking the paper, with an initial deposit, and then funded on what looks like a rolling basis, small. Regular contributions, sometimes monthly, sometimes less often, up until about 4 years ago, when the contributions stop, though the account kept accruing interest after that. There's a letter attached, which he asked me to give you before discussing the amount, if that's all right. He slid it across the desk. I recognized the handwriting before I recognized anything else about it. Small, upright, the same hand that used to write "See me," "Thurs" in the margins of my early drawings, and I had to put it down on my knee for a second before I could make myself read it. Naomi, if Feldman is doing his job, you'll have read this after the amount, or he's ignored me and you're reading it first. Either way, I want to say the boring part plainly so you don't spend time wondering. This isn't a gift for anything you did for me, and it isn't an apology for anything I didn't do. I started this the year you took the Sacramento job, because I meant what I said to you that Tuesday, and I wanted there to be something real behind the sentence, in case you ever needed it, and were too stubborn to ask. I kept adding to it quietly, because it never once occurred to me to stop, and I want you to know that doing it never cost me anything I minded losing. Build the real thing, Naomi. I mean the studio. I always meant the studio. RC. I didn't cry in Feldman's office. I want that on the record, because I think it matters. I sat very still and asked him, in a voice that came out steadier than I felt, what the amount was. And it was not a fortune, but it was not small either. Enough, he said, checking a second page, to more than cover the build-out costs and first 18 months of overhead for a small residential studio, almost to the dollar. As though it had been budgeted against a specific business plan rather than left as an open sum. There's one more thing, Feldman said, and reached for the cloth-wrapped item. He asked that this go with it. He unwrapped it on the desk between us, and it was a mechanical pencil, not mine, not the one in my drawer, but its twin, same manufacturer, same faded blue barrel, unmistakably decades old, kept somewhere all this time in a condition better than mine had ever been. There's no note on this part. He just said you'd know what it was. I sat there a long moment with that pencil in my hand, turning it over, and I understood, with a kind of vertigo I still haven't fully recovered from, that at some point, I couldn't begin to guess when, Robert had gone looking for a match to the one he'd left behind on that drafting table counter 15 years earlier, had found one, had kept it somewhere safe for years, for a reason he never explained and I will now never get to ask him about. I thought of every Thursday I had ever spent believing I understood the exact size and shape of what was happening between us. I thought of the awning, and the rain, and Eleanor's name spoken deliberately into that silence to close a door I'd never actually seen him lock from the other side. And I understood, sitting in that office, that I had spent 15 years certain I knew the outer boundary of Robert Callahan's care for me, and that the boundary had in fact been considerably larger than I'd ever let myself imagine. Not because he'd crossed it, not once, in all that time, but because he'd spent nearly 2 decades quietly building something just behind it. For me, that never once asked to be seen. "Miss Reyes," Feldman said gently, after a while, "are you all right?" "I think so," I said, and I meant it. Mostly, I just have to go back and look at a lot of old drawings. I didn't go home and look at drawings, not at first. I went home and pulled out the folder I'd kept since 2007, the one I'd always called, in my own head, Inspiration. The newspaper clippings about typewriter restorers and lighthouse keepers, gone brittle and yellow at the edges now, and I sat at my kitchen table and read every one of them again. Slowly, the way you reread a letter once you've learned who really wrote it. They didn't look like idle kindnesses anymore. They looked like a man leaving a trail of small, deliberate proof, over years, that he'd been paying a kind of attention most people never get from anyone in their whole lives. I called Denise that same night. She was retired by then too, living outside Chico, and she picked up on the second ring the way people do when they've been half expecting a call like this one. I told her about the will, the trust, the letter. She was quiet long enough that I asked if she was still there. "I wondered if it had ever come to something like this," she said finally. "Can I tell you something I never told you, back then?" I said yes. About 8 years ago, you'd already left for Sacramento. He came by my desk one afternoon, very casual about it, and asked me, like it was nothing, what I thought it cost to fit out a small studio space these days. Build out, permits, a couple years of overhead. I gave him a rough number off the top of my head, didn't think anything of it. Robert asked odd questions sometimes, you know that. I only remembered it again when Feldman's office called me last month to confirm some dates for the estate. It was the same number, near enough. He'd been building toward exactly this for years, Naomi. He wasn't guessing at what you'd need. He went and found out. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. I thought about the awning in the rain and Eleanor's name spoken carefully into that silence, and I understood something I hadn't quite let myself understand in Feldman's office, that the door being closed and the room behind it being tended were not, in fact, in any tension with each other. He had never once tried to open the door. He had simply spent 2 decades making sure that whatever was on the other side of it, should I ever need it, would be exactly enough. I didn't go to Eleanor right away. It took me almost 3 weeks to work up to it, and when I finally called, I didn't quite know what I was going to say until I heard her voice on the line, older than I remembered, but immediately, unmistakably kind in that same easy way she'd always been kind to me. She agreed to see me at the house out past the county line, the one with the garden she'd always been proud of, and when I got there, it was smaller than I'd pictured it all those years, and better kept than I expected of a widow 4 months into her grief. She made tea without asking if I wanted it, the way some people do, and we sat at her kitchen table, and for a while we talked about ordinary things. The firm, the sale, how strange retirement had been for him before he'd finally settled into it. Then I told her about the trust and the letter, and she listened without much surprise on her face, which I hadn't expected. "He told me, near the end," she said, turning her cup slowly on its saucer, not quite looking at me. "Not everything. Enough that there'd been someone at the office, years ago, that he'd cared about in a way he wasn't proud of and wasn't ashamed of either. That's how he put it. Which I remember because it struck me as a very Robert thing to say, trying to have it both ways even at the end." She looked up. "I didn't ask for a name. I didn't want one, honestly. But I think I always half knew there'd been a person the name would have belonged to. I felt something in my chest go very still. "I want to be clear with you," I said, "that nothing ever, he never once, I know," she said, gently, before I could finish. That's rather the point of what he told me. And I believe him, for what it's worth. Robert wasn't a man who did things by accident, Naomi, if he'd wanted to cross a line. In 30 years, I never once saw him fail to get exactly what he'd set his mind to. She said it without bitterness, almost with a kind of dry fondness, the way you'd describe a stubborn trait in someone you'd loved a long time. Whatever this was, it was the shape he chose to give it. That doesn't mean it didn't cost him something to keep it that shape. I imagine it did, but it was his to carry, and he carried it, and I'll admit there were nights I resented not knowing exactly what I was competing with, but I never once felt like I'd lost anything real to it. Does that make sense to you? Yes, I said, and found that it did. Before we left the kitchen table, I asked her about the Christmas party, the story I'd overheard all those years ago, about the house she and Robert had almost bought before they were married. I told her I'd never forgotten it, though I'd never known why it had stayed with me the way it had. She smiled at that, a real smile, the first one I'd seen from her that afternoon. That old story. He loved telling that one. She turned her cup again. It was a little place out near the river, before we had any money at all. We used to walk past it on Sundays, and Robert would say, one day, "That one," and I always thought he meant it as a joke, the way young men say things like that. Then, years later, long after we'd bought somewhere else entirely, he told me he'd actually gone back once, alone, just to see if it was still standing. It wasn't anything, really, just an old habit of his, going back to check on things he'd once wanted, long after wanting them had stopped being the point. She looked at me for a moment I understood perfectly. I don't think that was really a story about a house, if I'm honest. I think it was the only way Robert knew how to tell people that he didn't let go of things easily. Even when he'd made his peace with never having them, I didn't say anything to that. I didn't need to. We both understood, I think, exactly which door she'd just opened for me, gently, on purpose, the same way Robert always used to close his. We sat a while longer. Before I left, she asked if I wanted to see his study, and I said yes, and there, on a shelf above his old drafting table, retired for years by then, but kept, dust-free, clearly cared for, was a single-framed drawing, one of mine, an early bungalow renovation from 2006. The roofline I'd fixed that terrible Thursday after Curtis. Tapped twice by 2 fingers all those years ago, in a house that no longer needed fixing then either. I drove home that night and I didn't cry until I was through my own front door, and then I sat on my kitchen floor for a long time with both pencils in my hands, mine and his twin of it, turning them over, matching them up end to end, understanding finally that they had always been a pair. Waiting 15 years to be reunited, in exactly the way the two of us never were, and never would be now. I used the trust the way the letter told me to. The studio opened that August. Small, 4 people, my name on the lease, and I keep both pencils in the same drawer, wrapped in the same square of felt, and I have never once used either of them to draw a single line, because that isn't what they're for. The studio's first commission came in that September, a modest kitchen remodel for a young couple who reminded me, more than I let on, of myself at 23. On the first night I stayed late working through their drawings alone, I made myself a single cup of coffee, too much cream, no sugar, and sat with it a long time before I started, not out of superstition exactly, just a private observance I didn't feel the need to explain to anyone. I didn't hum while I worked. I've never had a tune of my own. But I found myself, without quite deciding to, tapping the drawing twice with 2 fingers when a line finally came out right, and I let myself do it, and I didn't feel foolish. And I think that's the closest I've come, in the time since, to understanding what he might have meant by building it twice. I think, in the end, that's what restraint actually buys you, if you hold on to it long enough. Not a story with a tidy shape, not a love you get to keep, but something quieter and stranger, proof, arriving decades late, that what you felt was never foolish, and that being careful with someone for long enough, for the right reasons, can be its own complete way of loving them, even if no one ever calls it that out loud. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.